Tere, mina olen Kati Kadarik.
Good morning, my name is Kati, Kadarik, and as Anna mentioned, I worked at the University of Uppsala in Sweden for 7 years, and my presentation is based on an article that we wrote together with the Swedish colleagues. At the moment, I am working in Tallinn at the CentAR, Estonian Centre for Applied Research, CentAR. So the mobility patterns, do they reduce or reproduce inequalities and segregation? So we were supposed to have another presenter whose presentation would have been in English, so my slides are actually in English, but I will convey the messages in Estonian. So as I have an academic background, the structure of my presentation is fairly academic, just posing the research problem. Why is it that we are studying it? What is the aim? What type of districts we studied? I mentioned Sweden, that was the clue. So what kind of data and methods we have used? Most of my presentation focuses on the results of the survey, and I'll also draw some conclusions and throw some discussion points in the air. Yesterday we discussed then the research problem. I perhaps won't go too much into it, but just to pose it very simply, we all live in different locations and places, different neighborhoods. We meet different people. So that is how we get different opportunities in our everyday life. Segregation is an issue in many cities. It's also actually an issue in Swedish cities and towns. Researchers and theory have agreed that segregation creates inequalities and reproduces inequalities. Yesterday we talked about the segregation theory and segregation in general, so I won't go into too many details. So how much time do we actually spend in our neighborhoods? We move around, we go to different environments, we meet different people, we travel to work, we take our children to school, we buy food in a shop, we spend our free time with our friends, we maybe go into the forest for a walk, we do sports and spend time on social media. So it is quite unclear how well our neighborhood actually reflects the fact what kind of people we meet and what kind of environments we hang out in. So these are our daily mobility patterns. Whether these patterns, they actually make they reproduce the segregation or they reduce it. So in case we meet a lot of people, move around a lot, then this actually reduces segregation. So the main aim of our article was to compare these daily mobility patterns, people from different neighborhoods. The neighborhoods were selected based on how many migrants live there. We also tried to discuss how and if these negative effects on segregation can be overcome by mobility or not. We looked at two particular districts, areas of Sweden. So northwest of Stockholm, they are sort of average districts, 150,000 residents in each, and they have two larger centers, fallen Borlänge and Gävle-Sandviken. So these are the names of the bigger towns. Why are they so special? Often when segregation is studied and the mobility patterns are studied, it's in larger cities. These are sort of average-sized towns. The distances are shorter and the levels of segregation are lower than in larger cities. You can see the map, so the grey and black points are the settled areas. Where there are no little points, then nobody lives there. So we had two databases. We used the population registry data, which gave us the sort of characteristics of the area, and we sort of took 1 square kilometer unit. So every square on the map is 1 square kilometer. We looked at how many people live in this area who are born outside of Europe. This characteristic is actually quite good to determine the socioeconomic characteristics. In case there are many people who are from outside Europe, it also means that there are people with low education levels, with lower income levels, or even unemployed. So we categorized these neighborhoods into 3. The first category, the area with low share of people born outside Europe, 3.2%, and 70% of people live in these type of neighborhoods. Second category, where the level was relatively high, 14% or so, depending on the region, and 20% then live in this type of areas. And the third category, which had a high share of people who were born outside of Europe, fallen Borlänge, around 42%. And only 10% of areas fall into this, or 10% of people live in these type of categories. And these are the neighborhoods that can be described as most vulnerable or most deprived. The map indicates that category 1 is light grey, category 2 is dark grey, and the black dots are category 3. So category 3 mostly falls into the cities. The second database we used is the mobile phone positioning, so to see where people go to track their mobility. So we looked at a particular day of the week, Thursday, because research has showed that Thursday is a regular working day. We also looked at Saturday, but I'm not going to go into the data of Saturday. So we have no information on who the user of the phone is. So we don't actually look at the people, but the phone. So we looked at 2 locations where the person is at night, so where their neighborhood is, and where they are during the working day, during the working hours. So the results. So phones can behave in 3 ways. They can either stay in the 1 square kilometer unit. So more than 50% of the phones stay in the area. They don't leave the area. Category 2 and category 3 phones. So a quarter of the phones then move around within the region, and about 10%, just over, depending on the categories, they then leave this particular region, either fallen Borlänge or Gävle-Sandviken. So what is the distance? How far do those phones travel? So the length of the trips that are made by those phones, or what's the longest of the journeys made. So phones from category 1, they distance the furthest and the most, so the distances are quite large. This table and all of those figures, most of you would like to grab your phones and check on what has happened on Facebook, so I'm not going to go into all of the method, but I would just like to indicate a couple of things. So the neighborhoods that the phones travel to can also be categorized according to the registry data. So what is the nighttime population, but we can also look at the phones that travel to this particular area. So on the left, we have the origin of the phones and where do they travel to. And in red, I've marked whether the movement takes within the category. So we have sort of actual values. And so the actual value between category 1 and 2 is 49%. But when we look at the registry data, then it's actually 63% of the phones that travel, and the same between category 2 and 3. So phones move a lot between areas that are similar than we actually presumed. And in green, the example whether the movement takes place from one type of a neighborhood to another type, so from category 3 to category 1. If we presume that 7% of all of the telephones in the area should move, but actually only 1.5 do. So the actual exchange between those neighborhoods or areas is very low. But when we look at the people who are around you based on the telephones, in blue, I have marked that category 2 and 3 neighborhoods, a total of 30% should travel there during the day. But when we actually look at the phones that have traveled there, the number is 50%. So the exposure to people from outside Europe is actually larger than with those neighborhoods where these people actually live. So those mobility patterns, when we look at the nighttime and daytime patterns, then they are very segregated. So where do people from category 1 travel to with their phones? So they go everywhere, all over. Between the towns, to peripherous locations, they travel distances, so they move around quite a lot. Category 2 neighborhood telephones, they do not move around as much. So G is for Gävle, they mostly move around within the town of Gävle. Some go a little further, but in Falun-Borlänge, people travel between the towns, but the distances are more limited. Category 3, the flows are even lower. They mainly move between the towns and within the towns. So what are the conclusions? How can I sum it up? So we must say that we do move to other regions within our neighborhood. So the flow, it can alleviate segregation to some extent, but the mobility patterns are highly segregated. So they generally affect people's exposure to different places and different people. Those people who start in areas with high shares of non-Europeans, they are more likely actually to remain in their home unit. So these are mostly people who are unemployed. They have no reason to leave their home. They stay. And much of the mobility is aimed at areas that are similar to where you are from, or where people that are similar to you, they move to the same area as you do, to the same neighborhood. So not as many such studies have been conducted in the United States based in larger cities. It was discovered that the mobility patterns are segregated. So our survey is on sort of towns with an average size of population, so the distances are shorter compared to the United States. People can actually cycle, so that's what Swedes do. They cycle a lot, public transport is available, so the opportunities are there. We then can say that such segregated mobility patterns, they also exist in other cities and countries. Based on the US studies, one of the reasons is that people just don't have any access to travel. But in Sweden, you can cycle, you can use public transport. So the distances and the access to means of travel, they alone cannot explain why those patterns are so segregated. And just as a conclusion, I'd just like to stress that segregation is a lot more than where we live. And in order to fight against segregation and to achieve a higher degree of mix, then we should look outside our residential area. If we focus more on this point that brings us together and the versatility than just the neighborhood, then this gives us ways how to fight against segregation and how to reduce these negative effects. So what could be these potential measures to increase this heterogeneity of the mobility patterns and to be more versatile? So perhaps we should offer opportunities for leisure in other districts, in other neighborhoods. Maybe we should try and change the school catchment areas or motivate people to travel elsewhere. But again, this contradicts what has been discussed with urban planning, and in Estonia as well, we've discussed this 15-minute ideal that ideally within 15 minutes from your home, whether you walk or go by bike, you should be able to access all the services so that you don't have to travel large distances. Schools, kindergarten, your place of work and where you do your shopping should be within this 15-minute radius. But then we get to the point that that's when we get to such a situation where we don't see people from other districts. If I live in Kalamaja, one of the suburbs of Tallinn, and I never encounter people from other parts of across Tallinn, Pirita or Nõmme. So these are points perhaps that should be discussed. This article that we published is available, and if you'd like to perhaps go further into the details of the tables I demonstrated, we wrote it together with our Swedish colleagues, and it was published in a special issue. The title is Vicious Circle of Segregation. We have Estonian academic editors, Professor Tiit Tammaru and Siiri Silman. Professor Tiit Tammaru has discussed this vicious circle of segregation, so the issue contains a couple of articles about Estonia. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's thank Kati Kadarik with applause. Please stay here with us. Just in case, let me ask the audience whether they have specific questions about the presentation. If not, then I use the opportunity and ask myself, because it wasn't very clear for me, it became a bit too complicated. We saw several categories and we saw that some of them were more mobile, some were not that mobile. Then what is the connection? Can you explain that once again? Who was from where? People with different backgrounds, were they the ones who were moving more, or vice versa? The ones with different ethnic backgrounds were not so mobile. Yes, we categorize the neighborhoods relying on their registered place of residence. So that means that there were neighborhoods where people with ethnic backgrounds outside Sweden lived and others. Yes, the ones who had moved from outside of Europe to Sweden, and there were about 3-4% of such people in some neighborhoods, and then category 3, that was the neighborhoods where more than 40% of inhabitants had come from outside Europe. Yeah, it's easier to say in English non-Europeans, but in Estonian we have that very long explanation. Okay, and you concluded that these neighborhoods where the Swedes traditionally lived, they were more mobile. Yes, but then I also mentioned that actually we don't know to whom the phones belonged. We just follow the mobility of the phone as such, which means that it is highly possible that the phone belonged to somebody else who had a different background. So 40-60%, that's the different ones. So once again, we don't know who have that phone at their disposal at the moment of moving. Thank you very much. And Kati will come back to the stage when we continue with our panel discussion. But the next speaker comes from the University of Tartu, and he conducted a study based on Kalamaja and Priisle in Tallinn.
Thank you. This has been a great conference. Thank you to the organizers. Over these couple of days, we have heard a lot of different facts. We've learned many new things. We've tried to overthrow certain stereotypes. There's a stereotype that people whose name starts with an A are at the top of the list. I sort of follow on from the previous presentation, but I am going to focus on Estonia, Tallinn, specifically 2 districts, Kalamaja, which I think is right behind me here, in the more or less center of Tallinn, and then Priisle, which is in the eastern part of Tallinn. I'm going to use GPS data and demonstrate how people's daily mobility patterns from people from 2 different districts of Tallinn differ, or perhaps they're the same. So what are some of the main ideas? Difference versus inequality. Difference is something that's horizontal. So this is the versatility. So no one's higher or lower, no one's better or worse. So everything is diverse. But inequality is always vertical. It involves ranking. So someone's at the top, someone's at the bottom. So inequalities can be avoided. They are morally unjustified, and there are also hierarchical differences. So this is our objective, that we should always try to decrease this inequality and try and control it. As for data, we live in an information society, a networked society. We use ICT services, the internet, mobile phones, bank payments, whatever. So every digital service, it leaves a trace. It leaves a trace about how the actual service works. But we can also look at the behavior of the users of the service. Where do they use it? What time? Where do these people come from who have come to use the service, etc. But with digital data, we always have to consider that there is a digital divide in our society. Not all members of the society have equal access to ICT. There are different reasons, be they education, time, motivation, cultural differences. So we have to be careful, meaning that if someone doesn't have a phone, we cannot use this person's data for mobile positioning. I mentioned mobile positioning. Not just Estonia, which has had a long experience in using mobile positioning, other countries are also using mobile positioning for time and space studies. So, well, most of us have a mobile phone. We use it a lot. It has become a sort of a digital body part. So we cannot live without our mobile phones. When we use our mobile phone, we leave a trace. Every time you make a call, your mobile phone operator makes a note. You know where you made the call from, who you are, when the call was made. Based on this information, we can tell where people have traveled to, where they have moved to, where they are located. But again, some people leave larger traces than others. Some have left no trace whatsoever. So some people who are more socially vulnerable, who don't have such good access, perhaps their data is not featured. But when we take this into account, we can actually make very good research. So this map is based on mobile positioning. It shows how people travel on the daily basis. So all the larger centers in Estonia are visible. In my title, I mentioned also the everyday activities space. Well, actually our life is very boring. Most of the time we sit at home. That's the large orange. So 100% is the time, and most of the time we spend at home. Sometimes, we go to work and elsewhere. So 90 to 95% of the time we stay somewhere, we don't move. But this 5% or even less is very important. The mobility is what we talk about, and that's something we talk about more than just staying at a place. Climate change, life becoming more expensive, fuel prices, everything has to do with mobility. Segregation studies often focus on residential segregation or ethnic nationality-based segregation. But as for mobility, as Kati demonstrated, is of utmost importance. I'm going to try and demonstrate how mobility between different regions and different ethnic groups can differentiate. So the activity space depends, well, the area that we cover, it depends on the needs and opportunities we have. First of all, where do we live? Do I live where I want or where I can? Do I work where I want or where I can? Are they close enough, the place where I work and where I live? What is the distance I have to cover to get to work, to come back home? So how are the place of work and home located in relation to services that are offered? This 15-minute concept, do I have to travel to the edge of the town to buy my necessities, or can I just go to the local convenience store? entertainment places, are they close? Do my friends live nearby? Well, in the digital world, ICT helps to keep relationships alive. So based on this, where we are located and how much we move, we talk about the demand or the need to move. Some have a larger demand, others have a lower demand. It all depends on who we are, where we live, and this need to move, it changes. Sometimes, in one stage of our life, we are helicopter parents. We have to transport our children across the town, and that is sort of like the main thing we do. So these people move around more because they need to fill other people's needs. So once we have the distances, this need to move is different, and it depends on what type of transportation mode we use, whether we can do this on foot, whether we cycle, use public transport, whether we have a car, or whether we fly, etc. So based on GPS data, so with the help of GPS, we use people's location. If you are sort of somewhere during the day, that's probably where you work. If you're somewhere in the evening, that's where you probably live. So that is how we can sort of find the meaningful places where people are located based on digital information, and that's how we carry out those time usage studies. And as for mobility, then this person is quite lucky. They don't have to spend much time traveling. But, if you live somewhere outside of a city and you commute, then you may spend hours on commuting, and that is quite a considerable share of your time. But to move on, the GPS study, a very specific study, so either within a year or a slightly longer time period, using a mobile phone app, we have collected mobile phone data, and this data is sent to our servers, and so we've studied people's mobility. So GPS is the so-called footprint. So these are two people on a couple of days where they are located in Tallinn. So we also have shown the speed of how they've moved. If it's red, it's a car. Green means that they have walked. And so these are the patterns and how different these patterns are. This is the area. So in red, we have people in Kalamaja, and in blue, the Priisle people. So first glimpse shows you that the blue network, the mobility pattern, it goes much further. So it is far from the city center, but then it goes to the city center. And Kalamaja, the group that was included, these people stay closer to their home, and the city center isn't far. So these people, their mobility is lower. But now looking at specific figures. So this sphere where people act during the day, it can be described in different ways. Some are perhaps more complex. I will try and introduce some more simple parameters today. When we measure how much do we actually move in a day, and we also know where the person lives, so at every point in time we can calculate how far from their home the person is located. Well, don't get stuck in this. You need to look at things more specifically, but this is based on ethnicity. So the lower axis is the time, midnight to midnight, And what happens in the early hours, that's the night, a person is at home. The points are close to the zero. Then in the morning, a person goes to work, school, wherever. We see how Estonians, they travel further from their home than those who are Russian. But the Estonians also get home earlier. They get back home earlier. They start later, so you can think of the structure of the person's work. They can wake up later, can drink coffee, enjoy it at home, or whether there are some other explanations. Kalamaja is an area where mostly ethnically Estonians live, but Priisle is an area where mainly people with Russian-speaking background reside. But we see the difference if we look at the ethnicity or the home area. Kalamaja residents, they travel further from their home. So again, we should include other researchers to find out why. But what we see is that the Kalamaja residents, they get back home later. It means that they stay somewhere within their area. I walked around Kalamaja last night. It's a great place to walk around. You pop from one cafe to another. People seem to know each other. So it's a very pleasant area where you have opportunities to communicate with others, not having to go far. But the idea is that you don't sit at home, but you go out and you find places where to spend your free time, and you have more contacts. So contacts out of home are higher. Age, the same. At different stages of our life, we have a different need for mobility. On the left-hand side, this graph, so how far are we located from our home? Young people leave early. I was surprised. Well, when I was a student, I went to the lecture at 10 o'clock in the morning. It seems that younger people nowadays, they are more active. And they also get back home the latest. Maybe they just hang around somewhere around the town. So these differences within the age groups exist. Education. Another interesting, so we have higher education and lower education. Interestingly enough, people with higher education, they can spend more time at home. That's their personal choice. They stay at home in the morning. They don't have to rush to work for 8 o'clock in the morning. They also arrive home earlier. There's always a question of interpretation. Does it mean that they go to a cafe after work, those who have lower education, or perhaps the time that it takes to travel from work to home is longer, or 8 to 5 they work, and after 5 o'clock they can only go to do their daily shopping, for example. Workplace. Again, something very logical, whether you are a blue-collar worker. I don't know if I'm actually allowed to use this term, blue-collar. They leave early, get back late. And those who are so-called white-collar workers, they stay at home late in the morning and also get back home early. As for income, same story. People with lower income, well, obviously pensioners, unemployed, pupils maybe, or they actually don't leave the house. They stay at home because they don't have financial opportunities to use the services. What am I going to do? I can't just sit in a cafe and watch others drink their coffee. That's not fun. So already because of this, their contacts and communications are lower. Well, things may seem to get rather boring, but I'll keep on going. So the scope of the area that is covered. For example, if you're at home, you're ill, you stay at home, you just, maybe go to make a cup of tea, but you don't walk more than 10 meters. In some cases, it may be 100 meters. But the further you go, the larger the area is. And in Priisle, this area is larger. So people in Priisle, they cover a much larger area than those in Kalamaja. At the same time, the previous graphs showed that people from Kalamaja, they go further, so there's a slight contradiction there. Why is it so? I don't quite know. Maybe we should interpret it in the following way, that the accessibility to services of those in Priisle is not so good. They have to go to different locations. This is something we need to study. And as for ethnicity, same story. Those with a Russian background, their area is larger. Days of the week. So we have different people from different ethnicities. They have different cultural backgrounds, historical backgrounds. So people who have Estonian as their language, they travel further also from the town to their summer homes, to family members who live in other areas, not just within the city of Tallinn, but in the countryside.
Läksin tiba sassi ilmselt, just Priisle on suurema tarbimisega. Aga selles mõttes ma ei läinud sassi, et ma tahtsin laupäeva ja pühapäeva kohta.
As for Saturdays and Sundays, then people from Priisle, they are not so mobile at the weekends because they don't have country houses or cottages elsewhere in Estonia. So why? What are the reasons? Maybe I confused you enough by now. Education, income, ethnicity. So when we look at the distance between the home and the workplace and how it is different with the ethnic groups, then those with Russian, their workplace is actually slightly closer than that of Estonians. And there is no difference in education. Those with lower education or higher education, the distance between home and work, it's roughly 10 kilometers. But the question is 10 kilometers a normal distance in Tallinn? I live in Tartu, and 10 kilometers is a massively long distance in Tallinn. It seems to be rather normal if you have to travel across town, for example. We get back to the point that if you live in one part of the town and travel through the town to get to there to work, is it your choice or is it that you're forced to do it because you just don't have any other option? Trying to sum it all up, when we look at mobility and the differences of the patterns, are they just because they're different? Or does it mean that there's inequality, or do they reflect some other inequality? In the Priisle region, are there plenty of services, places to work, to spend your free time, to stay there? Or is it the same in Kalamaja? Is it enough that there is a little cafe on each corner? Is it accessible for everyone? If we look at more vulnerable groups of the society. Such surveys numbers vary. One is high, the other one is low. But where does this inequality actually begin? How do we define this inequality? And this is something we should look into. Is it just one particular inequality or are there several? We talked about differences, inequalities of those in Priisle and Kalamaja. There was a difference in Estonians and Russians, but what difference is it? So, is it because I'm Estonian or because I come from Kalamaja? The same with income. So, you could see that there were differences. Education. So what are these key indicators where we could start implementing certain measures in order to improve the situation? I would also like to stress that we shouldn't get stuck in primitive stereotypical classification: man, woman, Estonian, Russian. Often within the group there is quite a large variety compared to the difference between the groups. So there is quite a large diversity, and we have to take it into account. Thank you.
Thank you. With your presentations, you came to where I wanted to start asking questions, that there are so many aspects to look at. Is there perhaps a priority list of these different aspects, something that is more important from the point of view of researcher than something else? One thing is that could be done or studied, another thing is that is being done. And very often we see that those simple or primitive classifications are used, as I brought the example women, men. But inside a group, the varieties may be way bigger. And as I am a population geographer, I am not a specialist to speak about socioeconomic theories. That's where we need cooperation between different sectors. It's all about interpretation. What does it mean that somebody is more mobile than the other? Is it a sign of inequality or is it a sign of diversity? So it's a positive thing. There's a question from the audience. On what year data is it all based? It's actually an ongoing study. We finished collecting the data 2021. It lasted for several months. And I have to underline that the data we are dealing here with are sensitive data, and there are all sorts of agreements and contracts signed, and the data is protected. But as a matter of fact, scientists are not very much interested who exactly is behind this dot. It's the patterns we are interested about. Thank you. And now I'd like to tell you that if you hear this disco music coming from behind the wall, it's a different event taking place there. Please try to avoid it. But now I'd like to call also Kati back to the stage, and let's start with the discussion. And again, I call upon the audience to be active, to ask questions. You can also use the web for asking questions, but the easiest way to do that would be just to give us a sign by raising your hand. And I would like to start by asking, now we had the examples from different countries. Segregation is something that has been formed in the course of a long time, but can you give us a short historical, let's say, summary, both on the Swedish and on Estonian example? How have we come to that point that we have neighborhoods which are based on one ethnicity? In Sweden, there are three main reasons why these neighborhoods have come into existence. The first is the residential policy. The second reason is the big influx of immigrants during a relatively short period of time. And the third is the growth of inequalities, which Anto also referred to. And the residential policy goes back to the 60s and 70s, where Sweden didn't have enough of residential space. And then there was a program passed by the government that 1 million homes will be built, and there were all sorts of buildings. But in the 70s, the ideal was flat in a high-rise block, and something like our Mustamägi or Lasnamägi districts, which is not very similar to Estonia. Yes, but then at that time it was the trend. This was a good place to live in. The main idea was to offer citizens an optimum place for a home. And that was not only in big cities, but also in smaller areas. And these districts usually had very good connections with the centers. They are located close to the underground stations, and it's because there was space for real estate development. But it was the government who was building. So these were not social houses, but they were built by the government, and then it was rented to ordinary people. But in the 90s, the government didn't have that many possibilities anymore. Also, more liberal policies were opted for, and from that earlier state-owned housing stock, quite a lot was sold to the private owners. And that means that whenever it was possible to get a profit, that's from where they started. And that means that some districts further away from the centers, they stayed as rental districts where renting a home prevailed. And that means that people who didn't have the opportunity to buy a home of themselves, of course, they opted for these districts where there was more rental space to find. And the rented flats, they were also of different prices. And of course, those who had the smallest possibilities, they rented the cheapest flats, and that helped to increase the inequality in the society. And we know that it was during recent years there was an especially big influx of immigration to Sweden, and the war now. So we have about 10 million people living in Sweden and 160,000 coming per year. That was quite a lot. And of course it influences the situation. And very often they go to live in the places, neighborhoods where they have already an accountant or a relative. Anto, what's different in our case? There are quite many similarities. When we were speaking about Lasnamäe, the high-rise block district, it was in the beginning the most modern district being developed in Tallinn. Can you imagine flats with all modern conveniences and central heating and so on? But then also people preferred, or for some reason, it was more Russian-speaking people who concentrated in these districts. And nowadays we see that the dominating ethnic group there is Russians. And at the same time, the process has made a U-turn, which means that the most prestigious districts have become the opposite, which means that they have the lower status, and people would rather prefer Kalamaja or Kakumäe or Pirita, more nature and beautiful views and so on.
selles mõttes me näeme...
From that point of view, I think there is a somewhat similar pattern. You can compare our situation also with Sweden. But we have to consider the fact that in some places the development of garden cities has not been so continuous. For example, the 21st century arrived much quicker than the 20th century. So the 21st century fiber optical connections for IT, they are there, but we don't have that regular road network or sewage systems. Yes, the availability of ICT in a district means or dictates a lot of the price of the real estate. So you may buy something very cheap, but if you don't have those support services available there, you are not interested. That dictates a lot of conditions for neighborhoods. And now, as we came to the communal services and utilities, in Estonia we have about 60,000 refugees from Ukraine. What are the lessons learned? What should one consider in order to make Estonia a friendly and kind place and a good home for them, so that we avoid the creation of those enclaves? In connection with in comparison with Sweden, the situations are different. In Sweden, the refugees are very different. They come practically without any prior educational level, but from Ukraine we heard already from one of the presentations that people very often have higher education and so on. So for Sweden, the most important thing is to find a suitable job or provide jobs for the newcomers. And once you've got a job in Sweden, then it solves most of the problems already. But in Estonia, we speak more about it's not just to get a job, but we speak about what kind of a job, because the discrepancies between incomes are bigger here. And let's say, location in what parts of Tallinn the refugees settle down, I don't think that there is a risk that we are going to have those enclaves, because we can't say that there is a part of Tallinn where rental prices are considerably lower than elsewhere. So these flats which are on the market for being rented out, they are distributed more or less evenly all over the Tallinn. But at the same time, I would also say that in Estonia, we don't have this residential policy, in the sense that the government is trying somehow to influence the residential diversity. I don't think that there is a fund of housing stock somewhere so that you can mix ethnic groups. And for example, for the city of Tallinn, it is very difficult to say that, well, in Kalamaja, the average price per square meter starts from 6,000 euros, but now we need to leave some places real estate plots for cheaper housing. But there is something in that idea. Okay, Anto, what do you think? Well, if we build a house and place Ukrainians there, so it has to be a very big house. But I think something that we should avoid is the creation of those ethnic residential areas, because when you have contacts with the people who are different, the segregation would be all the lower. And the diversity and trying to keep the diversity should be an aim in its own rights. But at the same time, it's a little bit more complicated issue, because what we need is actually finding the balance Otherwise, if we try to avoid segregation with all sorts of activities, we start hampering the identity of people. And we also have examples that to a certain extent segregation is something that these ethnic groups actually enjoy and need, and that's part of their identity. So it's always a question of balance. But again, if we only rely on statistics and start speaking in the language of percentages, so here we have 7%, okay, we need to increase this, and that's not a good approach. What's your opinion? How well have we managed with the Ukrainian refugees? Yes, I am opposing now what I heard from Anto, or actually second to what he has said. It's not the right way to start making people to settle down here or there. That's something that they had done in Sweden in the 70s and 80s when they started to officially displace people all over the territory of Sweden. And, well, you could live in Stockholm until you managed your language exam and so on. But what we saw was that at the long term, people still decided to move back to bigger cities, Stockholm, Malmö, and so on. You can't force people to live somewhere. And if a newcomer arrives, if they are able to find a place to live in themselves, that's quite okay. And for example, if they end up in those deprived areas, even if they were offered something else, they actually risk they have the risk of losing their subsidies the government is offering. But in many cases, that's the only choice they have. So you want to say that there still is something that we can learn from Sweden. What do the scientists think then about the current situation, about housing for Ukraine and so on? How well have we done? Are we successful or not? I don't have the data, exact data, where exactly are they living, but as much as I have heard, it's to a great extent their own job to find something where to settle down, where to rent or buy. But we also have to admit that the average level of housing prices is very high, and very often they can't afford to buy it. Of course, there are some maps, and when we look at where the children of Ukrainian refugees go to school, we can see that it is more or less covering the whole territory of Estonia, which means that the strategy has been quite good up to now. And considering the fact that it's a relatively short period, perhaps it's too early to draw any conclusions, but we see that different local governments have found solutions, and well, perhaps after a half year they re-decide that the first solution wasn't the best. But now coming back to what has been said earlier, we talked about infotechnology. How much does the mobility influence us, to whom we speak, whom do we communicate with? Very often these contacts, they stay on this hello, goodbye level. But how deep do those encounters go? Yes, with figures we have proved that most of the phone calls, or let's say the communication via digital channels, is going on with people who are located about 5 kilometers away from us, not any farther. And that means that it is more like calls about practical issues. But of course, mobility and certain types of encounters, they are not there anymore. Let's say you don't need to go to bank anymore physically, and that decreases your mobility in a certain way. And the mobility patterns and also the potential possibility of encounters has decreased. But on the other hand, perhaps it's good because these practical, let's say, things you had to do, they were never enjoyed, and very often they brought along also some misunderstandings or unhappy feelings. And it is on behalf of that we have now more free time for doing something that we enjoy, something that is not so practical and everyday need. Kati, so can you add something? You brought out this concept of 15-minute city, and the information technology rather hampers the need for moving around, or the mobility is decreasing. But at the same time, we heard that it's not that good always. Yes, the last time I visited a bank, I had to go and fetch my well, it was the office of the police and border guard. I had to fetch my ID card, and there were all sorts of encounters with people, and not all of them were highly positive. But then, yes, when I communicate with somebody via the net or my phone, I have thought about that. I think that it influences different groups in a different way, and that's a point to think about. Even in Kalamaja, the people living there, the population is not that homogeneous, as you said. So most of people go to workplaces very close to them, but then there are also some who don't have a job right now, or people who stay at home with their children, but there are also youth who perhaps avoid school classes and stay on the street. And then you may get the idea that it's even normal because you see so many children on the streets. I have a 2-year child at home, and my mobility patterns are very restricted. I go to my workplace, and then I go home, and then I go to kindergarten, fetch my kid, and my network is very limited also because of my child. But because of that, I have also met new people, parents of children who go to the same kindergarten. So children help the integration in this case. But now we have a question from the audience.
Well, the fact that people move less, does it mean that they are more segregated? Or perhaps we should look at it from a different angle. It's not just this particular Kalamaja region, but we have such sort of gated communities, capsuled communities elsewhere in Estonia and in other countries. Wealth sort of causes this feeling that I don't want to interact or communicate with anyone else. But as for the Kalamaja district, we can look at it from this point of view. But is it good or bad? It's the choice that these residents have made. They love being at home. So they don't have this necessity to leave. They are not forced to travel far for work. Maybe they work from home. They can go home earlier as well and enjoy being there. Such, so to say, gated communities, are they an issue? I lived in England, so on one street you had Bentleys, and on a parallel street you had social housing. In Estonia, this transition is softer. So in Sweden, is it an issue? Yes, in Sweden they've had this discussion and they have done surveys. Why do we address the situation of those who don't have much choice. We should actually study such gated communities and those who have a choice where they live, so middle class and those who are wealthier. They, like this white flight theory that was discussed yesterday, their choice to leave is there. If they don't like it, they leave. And there is another side to it. People in Kalamaja are the ones who are segregated. Anto doesn't seem to agree. Well, no, I was trying to, follow your train of thought. In Estonia, I think we have been able to hamper this process. In the early 1990s, if we look back at that period, we have a region close to Tallinn called Tiskre. It was even called Lollide Küla, the village of fools, with grand buildings. Well, yes, there are a number of such areas nearby Tallinn, but this gated community, I don't see it compared to California or the UK or Sweden. So this everyman's right that we have in Estonia, that you can follow the footpaths on the seaside, for example, and the gates haven't been built. So when you have a child growing up in Kalamaja or in Lasnamäe, does this also affect the future of these children where they live? Or people and the social patterns, they are quite sort of mobile? It has to do with a number of things. Is there actual inequality that exists, that the parent often thinks that they want the best for their child, so they want their child to go to the best school, and the decision, is it based on the prejudice, or is it actually carefully considered? Yesterday we talked about prejudice. It's one of the simplest ways and measures that can be implemented, that if we can reduce the prejudices and fears, then the situation would get better, and there's nothing wrong in being educated in Lasnamäe. Kati, would you like to add something? I'd just like to come back to what I mentioned at the end of my presentation, this visual circle of segregation, which has been talked about. Where we live, it determines where we go to school. Yesterday, Laura talked about where you go to school. It also determines your future workplace and the rest of your life. So it all boils down to where you originally are from. So the work that you will be doing, that depends on also the choices that you can make for where you are going to live. So all of these topics, they are so interlinked. We have to bear this in mind. Home, work, school, they're all related. So in some way, yes, there is a link there. So who are the victims of residential segregation? Which groups of the society? As I said, those who don't have this choice. Those who have lower income. In Estonia, the market determines the prices, the real estate prices. So if you don't have this financial means and choice where to live, where you can live, they, I think, are the most vulnerable. Indeed, there's an inequality of opportunities, whether I have to or I can. And if I have to, that's... But if I want to, then you have a choice whether I stay or move away. Kati already talked about the mobility patterns they also depend on the size of the cities. In Estonia, how visible is it that the size of towns, we don't have any metropolises in Estonia, but the size of the city it determines the community. Well, of course, in Estonia we have a hierarchy. We don't have, yes, any large-scale cities, but we have a big town. Tallinn, well, Tallinn is the biggest center that draws people in. We have some regional centers, Tartu, Pärnu. The towns in Ida-Virumaa, they need more attention. For example, Narva in the northeast of Estonia, 50,000 residents. But Narva doesn't have this tradition of commuting. It is determined by the fact that it's all right on the border, by the sort of geographical location, but it cannot become a regional center that offers services. So Jõhvi, Kohtla-Järve are becoming more important in that sense. The policies that we have developed from the regional development point of view, they perhaps have slightly failed. Tallinn is doing well. Tallinn doesn't lack labor force as some other regions do, so regional aid has actually reached Tallinn more than other local centers where they are actually needed in order to help to promote life and increase the situation. Narva and Ida-Virumaa, have they improved or stayed at the same level? Well, geographically they haven't moved, they're still there. That's an easy answer. Well, I think that the situation has improved. If previously we've looked at mobile positioning and done surveys, then people with a Russian-speaking background, the small space that they act in, so a Kohtla-Järve person is actually more linked to Tallinn than Narva, and they don't go elsewhere in Estonia. So this tendency has decreased. Those who are ethnically Russian, they do now travel around Estonia, move around the country. Mobile positioning has shown that the Old Believers area on the Lake Peipus has become more popular for those who are ethnically Russian. I come from faraway villages in Alutaguse, and when you look at those old farmhouses, well, 5-10 years ago, they were empty, but now people from Jõhvi and Kohtla-Järve, who are Russian speakers, have made them into their summer homes. We have questions from the audience as well. So what would make Estonians move to the Ida-Viru county? The real estate prices are low, there are good state schools. Could this attract people? Kati? We actually discussed this briefly yesterday about Ida-Virumaa. The teacher's salary is more than 3,000 euros. Well, to admit that, yes, it is a lot higher than my salary here in Tallinn, and that makes you think, yeah, it's an interesting experience. It does make you consider moving there to the Ida-Viru county. Laura talked about this education aspect, and schools themselves should try and distinguish themselves, how Russian schools could attract Estonian families. Same that these North Estonian districts could consider drawing Estonians to live there. So what are their selling points that would make people move there? Anto, would you like to add something? Well, the question is Do we want or do we agree with the fact that this high salary that teachers are offered in Ida-Viru County, will this not cause sort of like labor work tourism, that I work in Narva but I live in Tallinn? So what is the aim of the measure? So what are the problems that this could bring? Well, environmentalists will say that it's bad for the climate and that it's irrational that the mobility will increase between Tallinn and Narva. I do agree with that, but it won't cause another problem. Things will improve. Education can get better. That's a good fact. But it also could sort of bring along trying to make the local community more diverse. But this may not be the case. Yes, segregation. Who is being segregated? Is it based on the language or socioeconomic situations? For example, if we bring people from Tallinn to Narva, again, the inequality is going to play a role there, that the newcomers are getting paid a lot more than people who lived there for a long time. Well, as there are closed gentlemen's business clubs, then, for example, maybe in Narva there will be a Tallinn club or something like that. Is this a threat or an objective? Well, it's also been mentioned that inequality, we talk about it in the general sense. We have a broader view of it. Is this also an issue, Anto? In a way, yes. But it isn't an issue in the sense that we talk about it just in general terms, but the reason why we do so is that we just don't know the specific aspects. We should have more research-based surveys so that we're not stuck in stereotypes and say that Estonians, Russians, men, women, higher educated, lower educated, so that we don't have such stereotypical classifications that we are stuck to and start aiming at those groups, but we should look at how things are within the group. How precise can we be using those mobile means? How precise can we get to this? Are there any other ways, as if in Richard Gale's, any other ways of studying this, or what are the limits of the technical devices? We have big data coming in, Twitter data has been used, geolocational data, but with the Swedish mobile survey, we don't actually know anything about the user of the phone. So if we look at all of those smaller groups, so that we don't just generalize, we need the registry data. In Estonia, the registry data is quite okay, but it could be better. We have to bear in mind that data, yes, I'm a scientist, that data is the basis of everything. When we have data, then we can actually analyze things and come to conclusions. In Sweden, they have individual data for everyone. They know about pupil in the 9th year, what his or her marks at school are, or how much a person makes a month. So how come in Sweden do people have to fill in certain forms? No, these are registry data that the state collects, and scientists have access, research have access to this data. Yes. Anto, so how precise is your method? Is it different from Kati's method, and what are the future methods that we could use? We have used the similar mobile positioning data that has been collected using the same methodology. Estonia is one of the 2 countries in the world where mobile positioning data is used for national statistics, like tourism statistics, how many tourists travel to Estonia. I would like to stress that there is no one good database. We have to combine different sources. For example, if we take our national statistics, we have general data for the entire population, but in addition, we have very detailed panel studies where the selection group is smaller, but very detailed things are asked. And then we can go into further details and zoom in order to increase this segment of the social group. But we have to ask them very precisely, why is it that you do this? So one thing is we look at the points or maps that become red, but the other thing is that we need to actually get in touch with people and ask them, why is it that it's so? I'd also like to remind you all that in case you get an invitation to a survey, please answer the questions, take the time and fill in the survey. I can see some hands from the audience. We have a question from the audience. Could we have the microphone, please? Thank you.
I will try to ask in English. You were talking about like the movements, and my question is about the relationship between public transport and segregation, which comes back to earlier part in your question. I am from the Netherlands, and in the Netherlands there is a very dense public transport network. At the same time, it's rather expensive, and it's becoming more and more expensive. My question is, now I live now in Tallinn. I can use public transport for free in Tallinn. That's great. I don't own a car. I drive my bike. But is there research done that the fact that public transport is now for free in Tallinn, is it like reducing segregation? Is it helping somehow the mobility of people, or doesn't have any effect? What is your observation?
I think I can start maybe answering, and you can then wrap it up. I think Tallinn is a special case in that sense that, yes, public transport is for free, but the trend that we see is that people who use either public transport or bicycle or they walk to work, the trend is the number of those people is going down, although it should be going up. Like the priorities is to increase that number, but slowly it's going down. Not slowly, quite fast it's going down. And people are more and more using their cars. So it's Tallinn is a special case. Maybe you have something to add to that.
Yes, I think when we look what are the processes in Estonia, then one thing, for example, is urban sprawl. And in case of urban sprawl, it's almost you must have the car, 2 cars, otherwise you can't manage. And it's very common in Estonia to have a second home or summer house. Again, the case when you would like to go to countryside, then you have a lot of stuff, and public transportation is not very comfortable in that case. So I don't have any good solution how to improve it, how to reduce the car-oriented society. Maybe we can limit traffic in city centers, organize some park and ride parking solutions, but in general, to reduce the number of cars in society, it's quite a task, I think.
Yeah, and I think also with the public transportation, there's this that there are these discrepancies between Tallinn municipalities organizing its public transportation, and then there are these municipalities that a lot of people live but go to work in Tallinn, and then the public transportation, the buses don't really match, and a bus only takes to the end of Tallinn, and then you have to catch another one, or there's many stops on the way. So there's definitely room for improvement of public transportation, and also bicycle lanes in the city center. I'm also using a bike to go to work, and I would like to use the car as seldom as possible. So I'm pro-bicycle lanes in the city center.
Thank you. Kas on veel küsimusi publikus?
Thank you. Are there any other questions from the audience? Do raise your hand, please, to ask questions from our panelists. Well, if not, then I have a solution, sort of a set of solutions and sum it up. Well, are you planning to offer us solutions? Well, after lunch, we will have the politicians' debate. So what are the questions that you would like the politicians to answer? Well, I would just like to sort of start picking on the politicians and ask them a conference, such a large-scale conference, how many of them actually bothered to listen? So knowledge-based and taking solutions based on this knowledge. Often things are discussed in offices and decisions should be taken based on knowledge and data, objectively justified decisions, because often with many things we can't know 100%, but we can take clever decisions when we have listened and when we have data. During COVID, we had the research advisory committee that advised the government. Kati, so how would you see this? Yeah, why not fund research more? I don't maybe have direct questions to politicians, but there are a couple of points that I would like to stress still that politicians should bear in mind when taking decisions and having discussions based on the Swedish example. What is it that we can learn from Sweden? One of the main issues that has had an impact on things is that we should decrease inequality and this vicious circle of segregation, that things are interlinked. And something that we didn't have time to discuss, how, when discussing certain regions, it matters. How does the media discuss this? How do the politicians approach this? In Sweden, stigmatization and stigmatizing discourses have been discussed. We can say that this is such a problematic district, everything is terrible there. But the person who lives there, they think that everything is okay, that things are, services are there. So we should consider that the fact that we should not create these negative images of certain districts. For example, that Lasnamäe. I live in Lasnamäe, I like living there. But you sort of brought this up. So we ourselves can do a lot to change things. Anto, politicians should listen to scientists and researchers. So what would you, as a researcher, say to them? I have a very long list. But start from the top of the list. The main thing in the long-term perspective is education. So to organize our education so that the patterns and trends of segregation are not going upwards but downwards, education in the long-term perspective is universal. A solution. Thank you very much. An applause to Kati and Anto.